I never thought my compliance badge would bring down the man who destroyed my career. 6 years of building TechVision's compliance department erased when Jackson Wells smugly informed me, "Your role's been automated, darling." I placed my badge on his desk, hiding my devastation while he grinned victoriously. The next morning, chaos erupted. The CFO slammed his laptop shut after reading an IRS investigation email. In the emergency boardroom meeting, he held up my badge. "You did this?" The COO nodded proudly. The CFO slowly slid the badge to our horrified CEO. "We are in serious trouble." Looking back, I should have seen it coming. My name is Almira Walker, and until last week, I was the Senior Compliance Director at TechVision Enterprises, a rapidly growing tech firm in Seattle, specializing in cloud security solutions. I had built our compliance department from scratch 6 years ago when we were just a 30-person startup with big dreams and bigger regulatory challenges. TechVision grew exponentially under CEO Thomas Grant, a visionary leader who understood that in the security sector, compliance wasn't just a checkbox, it was our competitive advantage. Thomas and I had always worked well together. He valued my meticulous approach to navigating the complex web of industry regulations, and I appreciated his unwavering support whenever I flagged potential issues. Almira keeps us honest. He used to tell new executives during their onboarding, "When she raises a red flag, we stop and listen." That reputation had earned me a seat at the leadership table and the trust of our clients, who often cited our compliance excellence in testimonials. Our CFO, Andrew Parker, was equally appreciative of my work. A straight-laced financial expert with 20 years of experience, Andrew understood that compliance and financial integrity were two sides of the same coin. We frequently collaborated on quarterly reports, with him focusing on the numbers while I ensured every disclosure met regulatory requirements. "You save me from sleepless nights," Andrew once told me after we successfully navigated a particularly tricky SEC filing. "I've worked with companies that treat compliance as an afterthought. The fallout is never pretty." Everything changed 8 months ago when Jackson Wells joined TechVision as our new COO. Recruited from our largest competitor with promises of equity and eventual succession to CEO, Jackson arrived with a reputation for aggressive cost-cutting and operational transformation, corporate speak for layoffs and outsourcing. Tall, impeccably dressed, and armed with an MBA from Wharton, Jackson moved through the office with the confident air of someone who believed efficiency trumped everything else. From day one, he made it clear that he considered my department a cost center rather than a value driver. 5 full-time compliance specialists for a company our size? He questioned during his first week, scanning my department budget with obvious disapproval. "That's excessive by industry standards." "We're not just meeting industry standards," I explained. "We're exceeding them. That's why federal agencies trust our solutions when competitors can't get past their procurement requirements." Jackson smiled thinly. "Admirable, but we'll need to revisit this. Every department needs to optimize." Over the next few months, I watched as Jackson systematically targeted long-standing employees across the company. First to go was our veteran HR director, replaced by Stephanie Walsh, a former colleague of Jackson's who shared his efficiency-first philosophy. Next was our procurement team, reduced from 5 specialists to 2, with the rest of their functions outsourced to a third-party vendor that I later discovered was partially owned by Jackson's brother-in-law. Throughout it all, I documented Jackson's increasingly concerning pattern of bypassing compliance protocols. When he accelerated vendor payments without proper vetting, I filed an exception report. When he changed our data storage practices without completing required security assessments, I documented the violation and submitted it through proper channels. Each time, I approached these issues professionally, focusing on protecting the company rather than antagonizing Jackson. I even attempted to build a working relationship with him, scheduling bi-weekly meetings to discuss how compliance could support his efficiency initiatives without compromising our standards. Jackson would nod along, occasionally check his phone, and invariably end with some version of, "Great chat, Almira. We'll take these suggestions under advisement." Despite the tension, I remained hopeful. TechVision had weathered leadership changes before, and I believed that Thomas would eventually recognize the risks Jackson was introducing. My team continued our work with the same diligence, even as resources grew tighter and support from other departments dwindled. Then came the day I discovered Jackson had been meeting with representatives from Compliance AI, a startup promising to automate regulatory oversight using artificial intelligence. The calendar invitation had been sent to Thomas, Andrew, and several board members, but not to me, the person responsible for compliance strategy. I only learned about it when my assistant accidentally received a forwarded email about meeting preparations. My stomach dropped as I read through the meeting agenda. Revolutionizing TechVision's approach to compliance, the human-free alternative. The implications were unmistakable. Jackson wasn't just trying to trim my department, he was planning to eliminate it entirely. The following Monday, Thomas's executive assistant sent out invitations for the quarterly planning meeting, a session I had participated in since joining TechVision. My name was conspicuously absent from the recipient list. "There must be a mistake," I said, stopping by her desk that afternoon. Jessica looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Almira. Mr. Wells provided the list directly. When I asked about including you, he said compliance input would come later in the process." Later in the process. After all the important decisions had been made, I thanked Jessica and walked back to my office, struggling to maintain my composure as I passed curious colleagues in the hallway. That evening, after most employees had left, I confronted Jackson in the executive kitchen as he prepared his signature protein shake, a daily ritual he performed regardless of how late he worked. "Why was I excluded from the planning meeting?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Jackson didn't even look up as he measured protein powder with scientific precision. "We're streamlining the initial planning phase. Too many voices slow the process." "Compliance isn't too many voices," I countered. "It's an essential perspective, especially when we're mapping out new initiatives. You know that." He finally looked up, his expression a practiced mix of condescension and false sympathy. "Almira, your resistance to innovation is becoming problematic. The compliance automation review is happening whether you embrace it or not." "What compliance automation review?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Compliance AI presented a compelling solution last week. Their system can perform regulatory checks in seconds that currently take your team days. The board was impressed. "Did anyone in that room have compliance expertise?" I asked. "Did anyone raise concerns about automation limitations in contexts requiring judgment and regulatory interpretation?" Jackson screwed the lid onto his shaker cup. "This is exactly the kind of reaction that reinforces my point. The future is automated, Almira. Fighting it only positions you on the wrong side of progress." The next morning, I requested an urgent meeting with Thomas. To his credit, he made time for me that same day, though the 15 minutes he offered between calls hardly seemed adequate for the gravity of the situation. "I understand you're concerned," Thomas said after I outlined the dangers of fully automated compliance without human oversight. "But Jackson makes a compelling case for efficiency. Compliance AI's system has been implemented at 3 of our competitors already. Those competitors don't handle federal contracts with classified data requirements," I pointed out. "There are compliance functions that legally cannot be fully automated. We would be violating our own client contracts." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fair point. Why don't you work with Jackson on a compromise? Figure out which functions could be safely automated and which still need human oversight." I recognized the diplomatic sidestep but took the assignment seriously. Over the next week, I created a comprehensive report identifying which compliance functions could potentially be automated and which required human judgment and expertise. The document was thorough, balanced, and supported by regulatory citations and industry best practices. I sent copies to both Thomas and Jackson. Thomas replied with a quick, "Thanks, Almira. Good work." Jackson didn't respond at all. 2 weeks later, I discovered that Jackson had already purchased the Compliance AI system, the full enterprise package, not the hybrid model I had recommended. The 6-figure expenditure appeared in the procurement system, approved by Thomas with a note, "Strategic Initiative for Operational Efficiency." As word spread about the automation initiative, I noticed a shift in how other departments interacted with my team. Meetings were rescheduled without consulting us. Our input on new products was sought later in the development process, if at all. Even Andrew, typically my strongest ally in the C-suite, became more guarded in our interactions. "Just trying to stay out of the crossfire," he admitted when I questioned him. about a compliance review he had bypassed. Jackson has the board's ear right now. His cost-cutting measures have boosted our quarterly numbers significantly. The final blow came during a company-wide town hall meeting. Jackson took the stage to announce several strategic initiatives designed to position TechVision for its next growth phase. Midway through his presentation, he clicked to a slide titled, Compliance AI Initiative, Ensuring Accuracy Through Automation. "I'm particularly excited about this next project," Jackson said, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a seasoned corporate presenter. "For too long, our compliance processes have been manual, time-consuming, and prone to human error. By leveraging artificial intelligence, we can transform these outdated methodologies into a streamlined, error-free system that operates 24/7. My heart raced as I watched him present charts and graphs that came directly from my department's documentation, the very work he was now positioning as obsolete. Most disturbing was his characterization of the project as his brainchild, with no mention of my detailed analysis or recommendations. "Implementation begins next month," Jackson announced. "This represents a 7-figure annual savings while actually improving our compliance capabilities." After the meeting, as employees filed out discussing the announcements, Thomas caught up with me. "Exciting stuff, right? This could really differentiate us in the market." I looked at him, this man who had once valued my expertise above all else, and saw only a CEO dazzled by promises of cost savings and innovation. "The AI will need proper programming and oversight," I said carefully. "Otherwise, we're risking serious compliance failures." Thomas patted my shoulder. "That's why you'll be involved in the transition. Jackson assured me your expertise will be essential for the setup phase." But Jackson had no intention of involving me in anything. That much became crystal clear over the following weeks. The marginalization of my role accelerated rapidly after the town hall announcement. First, my team's compliance review tickets were rerouted to a new automation transition queue that I couldn't access. Then, my system permissions were quietly downgraded, limiting my visibility into ongoing compliance activities. "It must be a glitch with the new software integration," the IT support specialist suggested when I reported the issue. "I'll create a ticket, but fair warning, anything related to the compliance AI implementation has to go through Ted Williams for approval." Ted Williams. The name was new to me. Who's Ted Williams? Jackson just brought him in as automation transition manager. Former colleague of his, I think. Nice guy, but very by the book about the new processes. Ted Williams turned out to be a 30-something project manager with a buzz cut, a firm handshake, and absolutely zero compliance experience. When Jackson finally introduced us 3 days after Ted had started, the power dynamic was immediately clear. "Ted will be overseeing the compliance AI implementation," Jackson explained in a tone one might use when introducing a babysitter to a difficult child. "Almira, you'll help Ted understand our current compliance frameworks so he can properly configure the automation parameters." In other words, I was to train my replacement, or rather, train the person overseeing the system that would replace me. Over the next few weeks, I dutifully met with Ted, explaining the nuances of our compliance procedures and the regulatory requirements behind them. To his credit, Ted seemed genuinely interested in understanding the work, often staying late to ask thoughtful questions. "Between us," Ted confided one evening as we reviewed financial compliance protocols, "some of this seems too complex for complete automation. The judgment calls alone." "That's what I've been saying from the beginning," I agreed. "There's a reason the major accounting firms still employ thousands of human auditors despite decades of automation attempts." Ted nodded thoughtfully. "I'll mention it to Jackson." But whatever concerns Ted raised were evidently dismissed. The implementation timeline actually accelerated, with Jackson demanding daily progress reports and pushing for shortcuts that alarmed me. The first major red flag appeared when Ted implemented a simplified vendor validation process that bypassed crucial ownership verification steps required for federal contracts. When I pointed out the gap, Ted shrugged helplessly. "Jackson signed off on it. He says the full verification process creates unnecessary delays." "It's not unnecessary if it prevents us from accidentally contracting with entities barred from federal work," I countered. "That's an automatic breach of our government contracts." "I'll note your concern," Ted said, in the tone of someone who would do no such thing. I documented every shortcut, every bypassed protocol, and every compliance gap I identified, sending formal notifications to Jackson, Ted, and Thomas. The responses grew increasingly dismissive, with Jackson eventually replying to one detailed warning with a single line. Noted. The transition proceeds as planned. In desperation, I scheduled a meeting with Andrew, hoping the CFO's financial prudence would make him receptive to my concerns about potential regulatory penalties. Andrew listened intently as I outlined the compliance risks being introduced by the rushed automation. When I finished, he sighed deeply and removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose, a gesture I recognized from particularly stressful board meetings. Almira, I understand your concerns. Truly, I do. But Jackson has presented a cost-benefit analysis that the board has already approved. His projections show the efficiency gains far outweigh any potential compliance risks. Those projections are fundamentally flawed, I insisted. They don't account for the costs of even a single major compliance failure. One serious breach could easily exceed the projected annual savings. I raised similar points, Andrew admitted, but my hands are tied. Jackson has Thomas convinced this is the future, and Thomas has convinced the board. So we just wait until something breaks catastrophically? Andrew put his glasses back on, signaling the end of our candid conversation. Document everything. That's my advice. Whatever happens, make sure your warnings are on record. I left Andrew's office with a growing sense of dread. If even the risk-averse CFO couldn't or wouldn't intervene, my position was more precarious than I had realized. My fears were confirmed the following day when I received a calendar invitation for a 4 p.m. meeting titled Departmental Restructuring Discussion. The attendees included me, Jackson, Stephanie from HR, and Thomas. The location was the small conference room typically used for sensitive conversations like terminations. I spent the day preparing a final appeal, gathering evidence of compliance successes under my leadership, and documenting the specific regulatory requirements that necessitated human oversight. If this was my last stand, I wanted it to be substantive, rather than emotional. But as the day progressed, a more disturbing development emerged. My team members were being called into similar meetings at staggered intervals. Each returned, white-faced and silent, immediately beginning to clean out their desks. By 3:30, I understood what was happening. This wasn't a restructuring discussion. It was a mass layoff of the entire compliance department. My assistant, Lisa, appeared in my doorway with tears in her eyes. They're giving us 2 weeks severance for each year of service, she said quietly, and a non-disclosure agreement to sign before we leave. I hugged her tightly. I'm so sorry, Lisa. I tried to prevent this. We know you did, she assured me. Ted's been telling everyone this wasn't your decision. At least Ted had that much integrity. At exactly 4 o'clock, I walked into the small conference room with my head held high, determined not to give Jackson the satisfaction of seeing me distressed. Thomas sat at the head of the table, looking uncomfortable. Stephanie from HR had her laptop open, a termination script undoubtedly ready on her screen. Jackson stood by the window, gazing out at the Seattle skyline as if admiring his kingdom. Almira, please sit down, Thomas began, his voice carefully modulated to project regret he didn't actually feel. I'm afraid we have some difficult news. You're eliminating my position, I said flatly, along with my entire team. I'm aware. Thomas had the grace to look startled. Yes, well, as part of our strategic realignment. Your role has been fully automated, darling, Jackson interrupted, turning from the window with a triumphant smile. The AI system is online and operational as of this morning. Initial diagnostics show it's already processing compliance checks 80% faster than your team did. I turned to Thomas. I was promised a 6-month transition period to ensure proper knowledge transfer. Plans change, Jackson interjected before Thomas could respond. The board was impressed with our early results and approved an accelerated implementation. Stephanie cleared her throat. TechVision is prepared to offer you a generous severance package, she said, sliding a folder across the table. 6 months salary and benefits continuation, provided you sign the enclosed agreement by the end of the week. And if I don't sign? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then standard severance applies. 2 weeks, Stephanie replied with practiced neutrality. Thomas finally found his voice. Almira, your contributions to TechVision have been significant. This isn't a reflection on your performance. It's simply a business decision. I finished for him. I understand. I understood more than they realized. I understood that Thomas had sacrificed long-term security for short-term gains. I understood that Jackson had systematically undermined me to eliminate what he saw as an obstacle. And I understood that my 6 years of loyal service meant nothing compared to Jackson's promises of increased profit margins. Your company badge, please, Jackson said, extending his hand. For security purposes, you understand. I reached for the compliance badge hanging around my neck, the badge that granted me access to every secured system in the company, the badge that symbolized my role as the guardian of TechVision's regulatory integrity. With deliberate slowness, I removed it and placed it not in Jackson's outstretched hand, but on the table in front of him. I trust you'll handle compliance matters with the attention they deserve, I said, looking directly at Thomas rather than Jackson. As I gathered my personal belongings under the watchful eye of a security guard, a humiliating protocol for someone who had helped build the company, I noticed something odd. Through the glass wall of the server room, I saw Ted and Jackson huddled over a computer terminal. Ted appeared to be logging into a system while Jackson held what looked like my compliance badge. My badge, which should have been deactivated immediately after my termination. Later, as I waited for the elevator with my small box of personal items, I overheard 2 accounting staff discussing a rushed vendor payment reclassification that Jackson had ordered. He wants all the software development costs recategorized as capital expenditures instead of operating expenses, one was saying. Says it will look better for the quarterly report. Isn't that against tax regulations? The other asked. Probably, but compliance has been gutted, so who's going to flag it? The elevator arrived, and I stepped in, my mind racing. Reclassifying vendor payments wasn't just an accounting trick. It was a potentially serious violation of tax regulations that could trigger IRS penalties. And based on what I'd witnessed in the server room, Jackson might be using my still active credentials to authorize these changes. As the elevator doors closed, I realized I might have lost my job, but Jackson had just handed me the perfect weapon for accountability. The full weight of what had happened didn't hit me until I was sitting in my car in the parking garage. 6 years of my professional life had just been erased in a 15-minute meeting. My team people I had hired, trained, and mentored were now unemployed, and the compliance safeguards I had meticulously built were being dismantled by someone who saw regulations as inconvenient obstacles rather than necessary protections. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, fighting back tears of anger and humiliation. The security guard's pitying glance as he escorted me out. The carefully averted eyes of colleagues I'd worked alongside for years. Jackson's smug smile as he watched me leave the conference room. It all swirled together into a toxic mix of emotions I could barely contain. My phone buzzed with text messages from my team members, asking if I was okay and suggesting we meet for drinks later. I appreciated their concern, but couldn't face them yet, not when I felt responsible for failing to protect their jobs. Instead, I drove home in a daze, replaying every interaction with Jackson over the past 8 months, searching for what I could have done differently. Should I have been more aggressive in challenging his decisions? Should I have taken my concerns directly to the board? Would any approach have made a difference against someone so determined to eliminate me? By the time I reached my apartment, emotional exhaustion had given way to a strange, cold clarity. What I had witnessed in my final hours at TechVision wasn't just a callous corporate restructuring. It was potentially criminal misuse of compliance systems. I booted up my personal laptop and created a secure document, recording everything I could remember about the vendor payment reclassification discussion and Jackson's apparent use of my credentials. The details were still fresh, the specific terminology used, which staffers were discussing it, the exact time and location. I noted Jackson's presence in the server room with my badge, Ted's uncomfortable expression, and the timing immediately after my termination. As I documented these observations, a notification popped up on my phone, an automated alert from the compliance monitoring system I had implemented years ago. These alerts were sent to all compliance team members when certain high-risk actions were taken in company systems. This particular alert indicated that vendor payment categories for over 30 contracts had just been modified simultaneously. The user ID associated with the changes was mine. Jackson wasn't just using my badge for a one-time override. He was systematically making unauthorized changes under my credentials, creating a perfect scapegoat if the impropriety was ever discovered. I could almost hear his potential excuse. Almira made these changes vindictively before leaving. We had no idea until the audit. I took a screenshot of the alert, careful to include the timestamp and user information. Then I reviewed the specific IRS regulations governing expense classification. As I suspected, the changes Jackson was implementing constituted a clear violation of Tax Code Section 197, which governs amortization of intangible assets. By reclassifying ongoing development costs as capital expenditures, he was artificially inflating the company's quarterly profits while creating a significant tax liability. My phone rang, interrupting my research. It was Lisa, my former assistant. Almira? Are you okay? I'm fine, I lied. How about you? How are the others? Managing. We're meeting at Riverfront Bar at 7 if you want to join. She hesitated. There's something else. Something weird is happening with the compliance systems. My pulse quickened. What kind of weird? Ted's panicking. Apparently, there's some override being applied to vendor classifications, but the AI system is flagging conflicts with tax regulations. Ted tried to halt the process, but he doesn't have the authorization. Jackson told him to ignore the warnings. Is my user ID still active in the system? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Yes, Lisa confirmed, and it's being used to approve the overrides. Ted knows it's not you, but he's scared to say anything. Jackson threatened to withhold his severance if he creates problems during the transition. After thanking Lisa and promising to consider joining them later, I sat in silence, weighing my options. I could contact Thomas directly, but would he believe me over Jackson? I could reach out to Andrew, who might be more receptive given his financial oversight responsibilities. Or I could document everything and take a more formal approach. The compliance professional in me, the one who had spent years ensuring TechVision operated with integrity, knew exactly what needed to be done. This wasn't about revenge. It was about preventing a serious regulatory violation that could damage the company and potentially harm shareholders. I spent the next 3 hours meticulously documenting everything. The timeline of events, the specific regulatory violations, the unauthorized use of my credentials, and the warnings that had been ignored. I pulled up copies of the compliance reports I had previously submitted, highlighting where I had specifically cautioned against the very actions Jackson was now taking. Around 8:30, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Through the peephole, I saw Ted Williams shifting nervously in the hallway, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder. "Ted?" I said as I opened the door. "What are you doing here?" "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. I shouldn't be here, but I didn't know who else to talk to. I stepped aside to let him enter, noticing how disheveled he looked compared to his usual polished appearance. "Jackson's gone off the rails," Ted said once we were seated in my living room. "He's using your credentials to push through all kinds of system changes." When I questioned one particularly flagrant tax classification override, he told me to stop being a regulatory apologist and focus on getting the automation fully implemented. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked cautiously. Ted ran a hand over his buzz cut. "Because what he's doing is wrong and possibly illegal. He promised me this job would be about improving efficiency, not circumventing regulations. I'm a project manager, not a fall guy for tax fraud." "Has he explicitly asked you to do anything illegal?" "He asked me to backdate several system changes to make it look like they were implemented before the quarter ended. When I hesitated, he reminded me that I'm still in my probationary period and can be terminated without cause." I considered Ted's information carefully. His visit provided valuable third-party confirmation of Jackson's actions, but I was wary of becoming entangled in what could be a complex legal situation. "I appreciate you telling me this," I said finally. "But what exactly are you hoping I'll do?" Ted looked genuinely surprised by the question, I thought. "I mean, you're the compliance expert. Isn't there someone you can report this to? Some regulatory body?" "There is," I confirmed. "But filing such a report would have serious consequences for the company, for Jackson, and potentially for everyone involved in implementing these changes." including you. Ted paled visibly. I was just following orders. I documented my concerns in emails to Jackson. That's good, I assured him. Keep those emails. They may prove important. After Ted left, I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at my documentation. The path forward was clear, but I needed to be strategic. Emotional reactions wouldn't serve me now. I needed to approach this with the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized my work at TechVision. My compliance badge, the very symbol of my professional identity that Jackson had demanded I surrender, was now the instrument he was using to undermine the regulatory safeguards I had built. There was a painful irony there, but also an opportunity for accountability. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with one last alert from the compliance system. A final batch of vendor payment reclassifications had been approved using my credentials, followed by a system permission change that would prevent the automated tax compliance checks from flagging the modifications. Jackson had just crossed the line from aggressive accounting into potential tax fraud, and he had done it using my digital identity. If I needed any final confirmation that action was necessary, this was it. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of holding him accountable. Tonight, I would allow myself to grieve for the career and team I had lost. I woke the next morning with swollen eyes but a clear mind. Emotional processing was necessary, but now it was time for strategic action. Jackson had created this situation, but I would control how it unfolded from here. First, I needed expert guidance. I called Eleanor Richards, a retired corporate attorney who had been my mentor when I first entered the compliance field. Eleanor had helped TechVision navigate several complex regulatory situations in our early years, before retiring to focus on teaching and consulting. This is a delicate situation, Eleanor said after I explained everything. The unauthorized use of your credentials is problematic on multiple levels, but you need to be careful about how you proceed. What are my options? I asked. You could report the tax irregularities to the IRS as a whistleblower. You could notify the board directly. You could consult an employment attorney about wrongful termination, given the retaliatory nature of your dismissal after raising compliance concerns. Or you could do nothing and walk away. Walking away isn't an option, I said firmly. Not when my name is being attached to potential violations. Then let's think strategically, Eleanor advised. Any action you take should accomplish 3 things: protect your professional reputation, create a record of your good faith efforts to prevent violations, and motivate the company to correct the improper actions without destroying its value entirely. Following Eleanor's guidance, I spent the morning creating a detailed timeline of all compliance warnings I had submitted regarding Jackson's initiatives, including dates, recipients, and specific regulatory concerns raised. I also documented the unauthorized use of my credentials after termination, supported by screenshots of the system alerts. Around noon, I received an unexpected text from Andrew. Have you noticed anything unusual about the vendor payment system? Call me. I called immediately, but the conversation was brief and cryptic. Andrew, it's Almira. What's going on with the vendor payments? I can't talk now, he whispered. Too many people around. But check your old alerts. Something's not right with the classifications Jackson implemented. I've got a meeting. We'll try to call later. The call ended before I could respond, but Andrew's concern confirmed my suspicions. As the CFO, he would immediately recognize the tax implications of Jackson's reclassifications. After consulting again with Eleanor, I made my decision. I would submit a formal whistleblower report to the IRS regarding the improper expense classifications, focusing specifically on the unauthorized use of my credentials. This approach would protect my professional reputation while creating a record of my attempts to correct the violation. The IRS whistleblower process is designed to protect confidentiality, which would allow me to report the issue without immediately triggering a confrontation with Jackson or Thomas. It would also create an official record that could protect me if the company later attempted to blame me for the violations committed under my user ID. I spent the afternoon meticulously completing the IRS Form 211, Application for Award for Original Information, including detailed documentation of the specific tax code violations and evidence of the unauthorized credential use. The form required me to calculate the potential tax impact, which I estimated conservatively at several $1 million based on the scope of contracts being reclassified. Once the IRS submission was complete, I drafted a formal letter to the TechVision Board of Directors. The letter outlined my concerns about compliance shortcuts being implemented during the automation transition, specifically highlighting the risks associated with improper expense classification. I was careful to frame the letter as a good faith warning from a concerned former employee rather than an accusation or threat. As the former senior compliance director, I feel ethically obligated to ensure the board is fully informed about potential regulatory risks that may not be adequately reflected in internal reporting, I wrote. The recent reclassification of ongoing development expenses as capital expenditures raises significant concerns under IRS regulations, particularly Section 197. I concluded the letter by requesting that the board direct a review of recent system changes made using my credentials after my termination date. I am concerned that my user ID remains active in the system and is being used to authorize changes I would never have approved. After sending the board letter via certified mail to create a timestamp and delivery confirmation, I prepared a secure backup of all my documentation, storing copies both in encrypted cloud storage and on a physical drive that I placed in my safe deposit box. If questions arose later about what I knew and when I knew it, the evidence would be preserved. That evening, my phone rang again. It was Andrew, presumably calling from outside the office where he could speak freely. "Almira, we need to talk about what's happening," he began without preamble. "Jackson has been making significant changes to how we classify vendor payments, and he's overriding all the compliance flags using your credentials." "I'm aware," I replied carefully. "I've been receiving automated alerts." He told Thomas and me that these were changes you had approved before leaving part of a modernization initiative you supposedly designed, but the timestamps show they were implemented after your termination. I chose my next words carefully. I would never have approved those reclassifications. They directly violate tax regulations regarding expense amortization. Andrew was silent for a moment. "That's what I thought. The quarterly report goes out tomorrow with these new classifications. If they're improper, the company would be making false financial disclosures," I finished for him. "Andrew, I've submitted a formal letter to the board outlining these concerns. I've also taken steps to protect myself given that my credentials are being used without authorization." "What kind of steps?" he asked, his voice tense. "The kind that ensure I won't be blamed for violations committed using my user ID after I was escorted from the building." Andrew understood the implication. "I'll try to get Thomas to delay the quarterly report until we can review these classifications properly. If the board received your letter, that might give me the leverage I need." After hanging up, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. The company I had helped build was in jeopardy because of one executive's reckless actions, but at least someone in leadership was finally taking my concerns seriously. I spent a restless night wondering how events would unfold the next day. Would Andrew convince Thomas to pause the quarterly report? Would the board take my letter seriously? Would Jackson somehow find a way to deflect responsibility yet again? What I didn't anticipate was how quickly everything would unravel once the proper authorities became involved. The next morning, I was making coffee when my phone exploded with notifications. First came a text from Lisa. "Something big is happening. IRS just contacted the company. Emergency board meeting called." Next was a voicemail from Ted. "Almira, the system is flagging massive compliance violations on the vendor reclassifications. Jackson's freaking out, demanding I override them using your credentials again." I told him I wouldn't do it. He threatened to fire me on the spot. Most surprising was an email from Thomas himself, tersely requesting that I make myself available for an urgent consultation regarding compliance matters requiring immediate attention. I was still processing these messages when Lisa called directly. "You won't believe what's happening," she said, her voice a mixture of shock and satisfaction. "The IRS sent a formal notice announcing an immediate investigation into improper expense classifications in our quarterly filings. They specifically mentioned potential misuse of compliance credentials." "That was fast," I murmured, surprised by how quickly the IRS had acted on my report. "Jackson is raging, blaming the AI system for misinterpreting accounting standards." But here's the best part. The notice came right as the executive team was reviewing the quarterly report for release. Andrew opened the IRS email in front of everyone and literally slammed his laptop shut when he read it. "How do you know all this?" I asked. Ted's keeping us in the loop. He's in the executive wing right now. Says Jackson told everyone that you programmed the system to fail as revenge for being fired. I laughed despite myself. That doesn't even make sense. If I had that kind of access, why would I have let myself be fired in the first place? Exactly. Nobody's buying it, especially since Ted confirmed that Jackson was using your badge to override compliance protocols. After ending the call with Lisa, I checked my email again. Thomas had sent a follow-up message. Critical situation developing. Your expertise needed. Please come to the office at your earliest convenience. Security has been notified to expect you. I took my time getting ready, deliberately choosing a polished, professional outfit that projected confidence rather than desperation. This wasn't a plea for my job back. This was me responding as a professional to a crisis that I had warned about repeatedly. When I arrived at TechVision 2 hours later, the receptionist directed me immediately to the main boardroom rather than Thomas's office. As I approached, I could hear raised voices through the partially open door. "This is absurd," Jackson was shouting. "We can't let some disgruntled ex-employee derail our entire financial reporting because she's bitter about being replaced by technology." "The IRS doesn't launch investigations because of bitter ex-employees," Andrew responded, his normally calm voice tense with anger. "They investigate when they have evidence of tax code violations. Evidence that appears to have been created using Almira's credentials after she was terminated." I knocked on the doorframe and stepped into sudden silence. The boardroom contained Thomas, Andrew, Jackson, Ted, and 3 board members attending via video conference. All eyes turned to me. Thomas recovered first. "Almira, thank you for coming. We have a situation that requires your compliance expertise." Before I could respond, Jackson interjected. "If she's responsible for this manufactured crisis—" "Enough, Jackson," Thomas interrupted sharply. "We need solutions, not accusations." Andrew gestured to an empty chair. "Please, sit down. We've received a notice from the IRS questioning our vendor payment classifications in the quarterly report. They've initiated an investigation and frozen our filing until the matter is resolved." "I understand," I said, taking the seat but offering no further comment. "Let them ask the specific questions." "The issue," Andrew continued, "appears to center on recent reclassifications of software development expenses as capital expenditures rather than operational costs. The changes were implemented using your compliance credentials yesterday after your departure from the company." All eyes shifted briefly to Jackson, who glared back defiantly. Thomas leaned forward. "Almira, we need your help understanding how this happened and how to address it properly. Your compliance badge was used to authorize these changes. Can you explain that?" "My badge should have been deactivated immediately after my termination," I replied calmly. "I personally handed it to Jackson during my exit meeting. I have not had physical possession of it since then, nor did I authorize anyone to use my credentials." Andrew slid a paper across the table, a printout of the compliance system log, showing dozens of overrides executed under my user ID, all time-stamped after my termination. "All these changes were made without your knowledge or authorization?" he asked. "Correct. I had no access to company systems after being escorted from the building by security." Jackson scoffed. "This is obviously a setup. She probably created some automated script to trigger after she left, deliberately causing problems to make me look bad." Ted, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "That's not true. I personally witnessed you using Almira's badge to access the compliance systems yesterday afternoon. You instructed me to help you override the tax classification warnings, and when I expressed concerns, you said we could blame any issues on Almira if questions arose." The room fell silent again, as the implications of Ted's statement sank in. One of the board members on the video screen leaned closer to her camera. "Mr. Wells, did you use Miss Walker's credentials without authorization after her termination?" Jackson's face flushed. "I was implementing necessary changes to meet our quarterly targets. The compliance system was being unnecessarily rigid about classification standards that every other company in our industry ignores. As COO, I have authority to determine operational priorities." "That's not an answer to the question," the board member pressed. "Yes, I used her badge," Jackson finally admitted, "but only because the automated system wasn't fully implemented yet, and we needed to maintain continuity during transition. It was a practical workaround, not some nefarious scheme. Andrew held up the IRS notice. Practical or not, it's resulted in a federal investigation into potential tax fraud. The penalties could be severe, not to mention the reputational damage and potential shareholder lawsuits. Thomas turned to me. Almira, what's the fastest way to resolve this situation? Reverse the improper classifications immediately, I advised. Submit corrected filings to the IRS with a full explanation of the error. Conduct an independent audit of all changes made using my credentials after my termination, and implement proper credential management protocols to prevent unauthorized system access in the future. That could delay our quarterly report by weeks, Jackson protested. The market reaction will be nothing compared to the reaction if we're found to have knowingly filed improper tax documents, Andrew cut in. The IRS penalties alone could exceed $10 million, not to mention potential criminal liability. The board member who had questioned Jackson earlier spoke up again. Mr. Grant, I move that we follow Miss Walker's recommendations immediately, and I suggest we discuss Mr. Wells's continued employment in a separate executive session. Thomas nodded grimly, agreed on both counts. He turned to Jackson. Please surrender Almira's compliance badge now. Jackson's face contorted with anger and disbelief. This is ridiculous. I was acting in the company's best interest, making the hard decisions everyone else was too timid to make. The badge, Jackson, Thomas repeated firmly. With obvious reluctance, Jackson removed my compliance badge from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table, not to Thomas, but to Andrew. Andrew examined the badge, then looked up with a deep frown. This should have been deactivated immediately upon Almira's termination. That it wasn't represents a serious security breach that we'll need to address with IT. He then deliberately slid the badge toward Thomas, who picked it up with an expression of growing comprehension. This simple object, a plastic card with a chip, and my photo had become tangible evidence of Jackson's unauthorized actions and potential legal violations. We are in serious trouble, aren't we? Thomas asked quietly, looking at the badge in his hand. Yes, I answered honestly, but it's fixable if you act quickly and transparently. As the meeting concluded, Thomas asked me to stay behind while the others left. Jackson stormed out without looking at anyone, followed by Ted and Andrew. The video conference ended, leaving just Thomas and me in the suddenly quiet boardroom. I owe you an apology, Almira, Thomas said after a long moment. I let myself be dazzled by promises of efficiency and cost savings without considering the very real risks Jackson was introducing. You warned me repeatedly, and I didn't listen. You're not the first CEO to prioritize innovation over caution, I replied, not quite ready to absolve him completely. But compliance exists for a reason. It's not just bureaucratic red tape, it's protection against exactly this kind of situation. Thomas nodded slowly. The board has asked me to handle this situation, starting with appropriate personnel actions. Jackson will be terminated, effective immediately. And the compliance department? I asked. That's partly why I wanted to speak with you privately, Thomas said. We clearly made a mistake in dismantling the compliance function. The question now is how to rebuild it properly. I understood what he was asking, but I wasn't going to make it easy for him. After the way I'd been treated, TechVision would need to make a compelling case for my return. I'm available for consulting during your transition period, I said carefully. Beyond that, we would need to have a much more detailed conversation about structure, resources, and reporting relationships. Thomas looked simultaneously relieved and chagrined. Fair enough. Will you help us navigate this IRS investigation first? We'll compensate you at consultant rates, of course. I'll help, I agreed. But full transparency will be my only approach. No shortcuts, no cover-ups, no convenient scapegoating. I wouldn't expect anything less, Thomas said, extending his hand. That's why we need you. As I shook his hand, I felt neither triumph nor vindication, just a quiet certainty that accountability had finally arrived at TechVision. Jackson had believed he could bypass rules and guardrails without consequences. He had been wrong, and my compliance badge had been the instrument of his downfall. The next 4 weeks were a whirlwind of activity, as I helped TechVision navigate the IRS investigation while rebuilding its compliance infrastructure. Working initially as a consultant rather than an employee gave me the independence to be brutally honest about the company's vulnerabilities and the changes needed to address them. My first day back in the office, I found Jackson's personal effects already gone from his corner office, a cardboard box of his belongings sitting with security in the lobby. Ted told me later that the confrontation had been brief but intense. Security came for his laptop and phone while he was still arguing with the board about his termination, Ted recounted. When he realized it was actually happening, he threatened to sue for wrongful termination. Thomas just said, "Your unauthorized use of Almira's credentials is documented in our system logs. Would you like those logs to become part of a public legal proceeding?" Jackson had apparently left without further argument. The IRS investigation proceeded with the grim efficiency of all federal inquiries. I worked closely with Andrew to reverse the improper classifications and submit corrected filings, accompanied by a detailed explanation of the circumstances and the company's remediation efforts. "They're still going to fine us, aren't they?" Andrew asked after we submitted the corrections. "Almost certainly," I confirmed. "But coming forward voluntarily with corrections before any tax benefit was realized will significantly reduce the penalties." The board convened an emergency session to hear my assessment of the company's compliance vulnerabilities. I pulled no punches in my presentation, methodically outlining each shortcut Jackson had implemented and the specific regulatory risks each one created. The vendor classification issue was just the most immediately problematic, I explained. But there are at least a dozen other compliance gaps that need to be addressed before they become actual violations. The board chair, Eleanor Blackwell, regarded me with a mixture of respect and regret. "It seems we made a serious error in judgment by allowing the compliance function to be automated without proper oversight. What do you recommend going forward, Miss Walker?" "A hybrid approach," I suggested. "There are aspects of compliance monitoring that can benefit from automation and AI, but interpretation and judgment still require human expertise. I propose rebuilding a streamlined compliance department that leverages technology appropriately while maintaining human oversight for complex decisions." "And would you consider leading this rebuilt department?" Eleanor asked. "Under the right conditions," I replied, "which would include direct reporting to the board rather than through the CEO or COO, guaranteed independence, and adequate resources to do the job properly." The negotiations that followed were detailed and sometimes tense, but ultimately productive. Thomas, chastened by the near disaster, supported my demands for greater autonomy and authority. The board, facing potential shareholder lawsuits over the compliance failures, was equally motivated to establish robust protections. 2 weeks after the initial IRS notice, I accepted the position of Chief Compliance Officer at TechVision, a promotion from my previous role, with a substantial increase in both compensation and organizational authority. My first task was to rebuild my department, starting with reaching out to my former team members. "So we're all being rehired?" Lisa asked when I called her. "With promotions, back pay for the intervening period, and a formal apology from the company," I confirmed. "The board has acknowledged that the layoffs were retaliatory following our proper reporting of compliance concerns. And the AI system that was supposed to replace us will become a tool that supports our work rather than replaces it," I explained. "There are monitoring functions it performs very efficiently, which will actually free us to focus on more complex compliance issues." By the 3rd week, my rebuilt department was operational, and we had implemented new safeguards against credential misuse and compliance overrides. Every system access now required multi-factor authentication, and high-risk actions triggered automatic notifications to multiple stakeholders, not just the compliance team. The IRS eventually concluded its investigation with a financial penalty that, while significant, was far less severe than it might have been had we not voluntarily corrected the violations. The board accepted the penalty without protest, considering it a necessary consequence of their governance failures. Throughout this period, I had limited direct contact with Thomas outside of formal meetings. I maintained a strictly professional demeanor, neither hostile nor particularly warm. The trust that had once existed between us had been broken when he chose Jackson's empty promises over my substantiated warnings, and rebuilding it would take time. That changed during the 4th week, when Thomas asked me to join him for coffee in the small park across from our office building. Away from the corporate environment, he seemed less the confident CEO and more a man genuinely reckoning with his mistakes. "I want to apologize properly, Almira," he said as we sat on a bench overlooking the city. "Not as your boss or as the CEO, but as someone who betrayed your trust after years of collaboration." "Why did you do it?" I asked, the question that had been nagging at me for weeks. "You always understood the value of compliance before Jackson arrived." Thomas sighed deeply. The board was pushing for more aggressive growth metrics. Jackson presented automation as a way to simultaneously cut costs and improve efficiency, the perfect solution to the growth problem. I wanted to believe him because it solved my immediate challenges. "Even when I specifically warned you about the risks?" "Especially then," Thomas admitted. "Your warnings meant I'd have to make a difficult choice between immediate results and long-term security. I took the easy path, convincing myself that Jackson's confidence meant he had everything under control." His candor was unexpected but appreciated. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we rebuild properly this time. The board has approved a new executive structure that elevates compliance to a C-suite function with direct board reporting. Your role will have equal standing with the CFO and the new COO once we find a suitable replacement for Jackson. And the compliance automation initiative will proceed only under your direct supervision, with clear boundaries around what can be automated and what requires human judgment." I nodded, satisfied with this resolution, but still processing the emotional aftermath of being discarded so easily after years of loyal service. "It will take time to rebuild trust, Thomas." "I know," he acknowledged. "I'm prepared to earn it back, however long that takes." The final piece of closure came unexpectedly, 3 days later. I was working late, reviewing updated compliance protocols, when a security alert notified me that Jackson Wells had entered the building. My first instinct was, concern, was he here to confront someone? Cause trouble? I called security immediately. "Why is Jackson Wells in the building?" "He's been terminated." "He's here to collect his remaining personal items, Miss Walker," the security officer explained. "Mr. Grant authorized it outside of business hours to avoid disruption. I'm escorting him personally." "Please bring him to my office when he's finished," I requested. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. Jackson stood in the doorway, a small box under his arm and a security guard behind him. His normally immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, his expression a mix of resentment and resignation. "You wanted to see me?" he asked stiffly. "I thought we should have a proper goodbye," I said, gesturing for him to enter. The security guard remained at the door, watching attentively. Jackson set his box down and faced me across my desk, the same desk I'd had before, now situated in a larger office with a nameplate reading Chief Compliance Officer. "Enjoying your victory lap?" he asked bitterly. "This isn't about winning or losing," I replied. "It's about consequences for choices. You chose to dismantle essential safeguards, override regulations, and use my credentials without authorization. Those actions had predictable outcomes." "I was innovating," Jackson insisted. "Every major company is automating compliance functions. I was just ahead of the curve." "Innovation without integrity isn't progress," I countered. "And using someone else's credentials to bypass security protocols isn't automation, it's fraud." Jackson's face flushed. "Is that why you called me in here? To lecture me?" "No." I opened my desk drawer and removed a small object, my old compliance badge, now deactivated and marked with a hole punch to indicate its invalid status. "I thought you should have this as a reminder." I placed the badge on the desk between us. "Compliance isn't just rules and regulations, Jackson. It's about trust. The trust of our customers, our shareholders, our partners, and most importantly, the trust between colleagues. You betrayed that trust at every level." Jackson stared at the badge, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might launch into another defensive tirade or simply walk out. Instead, he picked up the badge and examined it silently. "The irony is," he finally said, "I genuinely believed I was doing what was best for the company. Cutting costs, increasing efficiency, streamlining operations. The road to hell is paved with efficiency metrics," I replied. "Sometimes the fastest path forward leads straight off a cliff." Jackson pocketed the badge and picked up his box. Good luck, Almira. Tech Vision is lucky to have you, though I doubt they deserve you. With that surprisingly gracious parting, he nodded to the security guard and left. I watched through the glass walls of my office as he walked down the corridor for the last time, a once-rising executive undone by his own arrogance and disregard for necessary guardrails. 3 months after the crisis, Tech Vision held its annual leadership summit. As the newest C-suite executive, I was invited to deliver a keynote on the theme of innovation with integrity. The audience included not just our own employees, but clients, partners, and industry analysts. I spoke about the false dichotomy between compliance and efficiency, about how proper guardrails enable sustainable growth rather than hindering it. I discussed the role of technology in compliance without shying away from the lessons of our recent experience. Automation is a powerful tool, I concluded, but it must be guided by human judgment, ethical considerations, and regulatory expertise. The compliance function exists not to say no, but to help the organization find the right yes, one that protects all stakeholders while enabling innovation and growth. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but more meaningful was the quiet nod of approval from Thomas and the board members in the front row. They had learned the hard way what I had been telling them all along. Compliance isn't a luxury or a cost center. It's essential infrastructure for any organization that wants to succeed in the long term. Later that evening, during the reception, I found myself standing next to Andrew, watching as employees and partners mingled in an atmosphere of renewed optimism. Quite a turnaround from where we were a few months ago, he observed. Complete with valuable lessons learned, I agreed. Andrew smiled. The most important being, never underestimate a compliance professional with receipts. I laughed at that. Document everything, the first rule of compliance and, as it turns out, career self-defense. You know, Andrew said thoughtfully, I think the company is stronger now than it would have been if none of this had happened. We've built better systems, clearer accountability, and a more balanced approach to innovation. He was right. The crisis had forced Tech Vision to address fundamental flaws in its governance and culture. My new compliance department was respected rather than resented, and the integration of appropriate automation tools had actually increased our effectiveness while reducing mundane workloads. Sometimes it takes a near disaster to create real change. My compliance badge, the symbol of my professional identity that Jackson had tried to misuse, had become the catalyst for transforming Tech Vision's approach to regulatory integrity. As I looked around at the revitalized company, I reflected on the journey from devastation to vindication. I hadn't sought revenge when Jackson undermined me, but I had refused to be silent when principles and regulations were violated. That principled stand had ultimately created something better than retribution, reform. In the corporate world, as in life, the strongest guardrails aren't rules or systems, but people of integrity who are willing to stand firm when it matters most. Sometimes being outmaneuvered is just the first step in changing the entire game. Have you ever had to stand up for your principles in a professional setting, even when it felt like you were standing alone? The courage to maintain integrity when facing pressure to compromise is something we all struggle with. I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more corporate tales of triumph and transformation, and share with colleagues who might be facing similar challenges in their own workplaces. Thank you for joining me on this journey. From betrayal to vindication, may we all find the strength to stand firm when our professional integrity is tested.